April 1945, the soldiers of the U.S. 3rd Armored Division pushed into the heart of Germany, expecting to find factories or bunkers. Instead, they stumbled into a nightmare that defied human comprehension. Near the town of Nordhausen, they discovered the entrance to the Mittelwerk, a massive underground labyrinth carved into the Kohnstein mountain. As the men entered the dark, damp tunnels, the beams of their flashlights cut through the gloom to reveal a sight that stopped their hearts. Stretching for miles into the darkness were rows of the most advanced technology on Earth, the V-2 rockets. These were the world's first long-range ballistic missiles, sleek, terrifying vengeance weapons designed to strike London from hundreds of miles away. They were marvels of engineering, the ancestors of the ships that would one day carry men to the moon. But as the American GIs moved closer, they realized the horrific price of this progress. Piled in the shadows between the gleaming rocket engines and the high-tech guidance systems were thousands of bodies. These were the prisoners of the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp, slave laborers from across Europe who had been worked to death in total darkness. The soldiers saw skeletal men still clutching wrenches who had died where they stood from starvation, exhaustion, and the brutal beings of their SS overseers. The air in the tunnels was thick with the smell of death and ozone. For the American soldiers, the V-2 was no longer a scientific achievement. It was a blood-stained monument to cruelty. They walked past the scientists' blueprints and the pristine laboratory equipment, only to find the hospital barracks where the sick were left to rot. This was the birthplace of the space age, built on the bones of 20,000 victims. As the soldiers emerged from the tunnels into the cold German air, they were changed forever. They had seen the genius of the German rocket scientists, but they had also seen the screams etched into the very metal of the machines. It was a memory that would make the coming orders from Washington to protect and recruit these same scientists almost impossible to swallow. As the dust of the Second World War began to settle, a new, colder conflict was already taking shape. Behind the closed doors of the Pentagon, a secret directive was issued that would leave American frontline soldiers feeling betrayed. It was known as Operation Paperclip. The mission was simple but morally devastating. Locate the top Nazi rocket scientists and bring them to the United States before the Soviet Union could get their hands on them. In the chaos of occupied Germany, American intelligence officers began scouring the ruins for the men who had designed the V-2 rockets. Among them was Werner von Braun, a brilliant engineer who had also been an SS officer. To the politicians in Washington, these men were intellectual reparations, the ultimate war trophy. They believed that the nation that controlled the German brains would control the future of the Cold War. But there was a major legal obstacle. President Truman had explicitly forbidden the recruitment of anyone found to be active supporters of Nazism. To bypass this, military intelligence officers took the files of scientists with deep ties to the Nazi Party and simply altered them. They attached a simple paperclip to the dossiers of the scientists they wanted to save, signaling that their war crimes were to be ignored and their records cleansed. For the American GIs tasked with guarding these scientists, the situation was surreal. Only weeks earlier, they had been liberating concentration camps and burying their brothers. Now they were ordered to provide luxury rations, safe transport, and high-security housing for the very men who had built the weapons of the Third Reich. The secret recruitment was a cold, calculated transaction. The United States would trade moral justice for scientific supremacy. The scientists weren't being tried for their past, they were being hired for the future. leaving the soldiers who had fought the war to wonder if the victory they had won was already being compromised in the shadows. In late 1945, the scorching desert sun of El Paso, Texas, bore witness to one of the most awkward encounters in military history. A group of men stepped off a transport bus at Fort Bliss, dressed not in uniforms, but in sharp European suits and fedoras. These were Wernher von Braun and his team of rocket specialists. They were greeted not by a cheering crowd, but by a wall of icy silence from the American soldiers stationed there. For the GIs at Fort Bliss, many of whom were combat veterans with fresh scars from the European theater, the arrival of the German specialists was a bitter pill to swallow. These soldiers had spent years fighting the Nazi machine, losing friends to V2 strikes and witnessing the horrors of the camps. Now, by order of the Pentagon, they were serving as guards and technicians for the very men who had been the intellectual spine of the Third Reich. The tension was thick enough to cut with a bayonet. At the mess hall, soldiers would stand up and leave a table the moment a German scientist sat down. In the hallways of the research facilities, the traditional military salute was replaced by a stiff, neck-stretching gaze into the distance. The American soldiers flatly refused to shake hands. To extend a hand was to offer forgiveness, and for many of these veterans, forgiveness was not for sale. The scientists were given privileges that outraged the lower-ranking soldiers: better housing, specialized food, and a degree of freedom that felt like a slap in the face to those who had just liberated Europe. The soldiers saw the scientists as unrepentant opportunists, while the scientists viewed the Americans as technologically inferior jailers. This was the reality of Fort Bliss, a high-stakes laboratory where the future of the space age was being built by two groups of men who despised one another, separated by a gap of moral disgust that no government directive could bridge.
By 1950, the American government faced a massive public relations nightmare: how to explain to the public that the men building their defense system were the same men who had served the Führer. To solve this, a calculated campaign of the moral compromise began. The Pentagon and the newly formed CIA began a systematic effort to sanitize the pasts of the Paperclip scientists. Wernher von Braun, once a wearer of the SS uniform, was transformed into a friendly, charismatic face of the future. He began appearing on Disney television specials, smiling beside Walt Disney, talking to American families about man in space. His Nazi ties were buried under layers of classified folders, replaced by the narrative that he was a reluctant scientist who only cared about the stars, not the regime. But for the American soldiers and intelligence officers who knew the truth, this rebranding felt like a betrayal of the dead. Veterans who had seen the underground slave factories of Dora Mittelbau watched in disbelief as their government turned war criminals into national heroes. Inside the research facilities at Huntsville and White Sands, the tension reached a breaking point. Soldiers were ordered to suppress their personal feelings for the sake of national security. The Cold War with the Soviet Union was now the ultimate justification. Anything was permissible if it kept America ahead of the Russians. This chapter of history represents a dark bargain. The U.S. government decided that the genius of these men was more valuable than the justice they owed to the victims of the Holocaust. It was a silence bought with government paychecks. The moral compromise meant that America would look the other way, choosing to reach for the moon while standing on ground that was still stained with the blood of the scientists' past. To the soldiers who still refused to shake their hands, no amount of scientific progress could ever wash away the scent of the tunnels.
On July 20, 1969, the world stood still as Neil Armstrong took his one giant leap for mankind. In the Mission Control Center and across living rooms in America, there was a sense of pure, unadulterated triumph. But in the shadows of that victory stood a group of aging men with German accents, the architects of the Saturn V rocket. The journey that ended on the lunar surface had begun 25 years earlier in the death tunnels of Mittelbau-Dora. This final chapter explores the staggering, bittersweet reality of the Apollo program. The very same hands that had designed the V-2 rockets to rain terror on London had now built the vessel that carried humanity to the stars. Wernher von Braun was now a national hero, a visionary who had fulfilled the American dream. Yet for the veterans of World War II who were still alive to see the moon landing, the celebration was complicated. They looked at the flickering black and white footage of the rocket launch and saw more than just fire and smoke. They saw the ghosts of the 20,000 slave laborers who died to perfect that technology. The legacy of the Stinger, or the grit of the backwoods hunter, were stories of individual courage, but the story of the Paperclip scientists was one of a collective national silence. The United States had successfully traded its moral ledger for the lunar soil. The scientists had helped America win the Cold War, and in exchange, the world agreed to forget where they came from. As the Apollo era closed, the secret of Operation Paperclip slowly began to leak into the public consciousness. The refusal of those early GIs to shake hands at Fort Bliss was finally understood for what it was, a desperate, lonely protest against the whitewashing of history. The moon landing was a testament to what humanity can achieve when it reaches for the impossible, but it also remains a haunting reminder of the dark compromises made along the way. We went to the moon, but we carried the weight of the Holocaust in the fuel tanks of the rockets that took us there.